Here's Canada, a country that ranks fourth in the world for oil production. In 2024, it pumped about 5 million barrels a day, behind only Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States. Sounds impressive, but there's one huge catch. To understand it, we need to move to Canada's east coast. This is a live online map of marine traffic, and these are the oil tankers sailing into Canada and out of the country. Notice something odd? Yep. Despite having plenty of its own oil, Canada imports hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude per day. And it's coming from the other side of the planet, from places like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, shipped all the way to Canada. And it can cost around 3 times more than Canadian oil. But that's not even the most interesting part. Canada also sends about 80% of the oil it produces straight to the US. If you're confused about what's going on, trust me, so am I. So let's find out why Canada doesn't use the millions of barrels it produces itself and why it needs oil from Africa in the first place. Let's look at where Canada actually produces this huge amount of oil. Production isn't spread evenly across the country. More than 80% of Canada's black gold, or about 4.3 million barrels per day, comes from one specific place. Here it is, Alberta, a province in Western Canada. And this is where the problem begins, because the province itself simply can't consume that much oil. Only about 5 million people live in Alberta out of 40+ million across all of Canada, so local energy demand is obviously quite low. Normal household and industrial use can't possibly eat up the millions of barrels produced every single day. So where are Canada's main consumers of oil? Over here in the east, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick provinces, home to major cities like Toronto and Montreal. These are heavily populated, highly industrialized regions where much of the country's population and manufacturing are concentrated. People use energy every day, and businesses run around the clock, burning enormous amounts of fuel. And here's the most interesting part. All of that is roughly 1,550 miles away from Alberta. A massive distance. But wait, oil's moved through pipelines, right? So how's Canada doing on that front? On paper, it looks fine. The key artery, Enbridge Mainline, does connect Alberta to central and eastern Canada, routing through the United States. But the issue is that this system isn't a brand new modern trunk line designed for today's production volumes. It's a network of pipes assembled and expanded over decades for a very different scale. As a result, the pipeline now runs close to its capacity limits and physically can't move the full 4.3 million barrels per day that Alberta produces. Which raises a logical question. Why not build a new pipeline? For starters, that would cost an unreal amount, and the route wouldn't be a simple flat stretch. It'd have to cross rivers, hills, valleys. By some estimates, a new eastbound line would cost at least $25 billion. Add public opposition, spill risks. In short, that's not really an option. So let's try another route. What about rail? You can move oil by train. Unfortunately, that option scares both economists and the public. First, shipping oil by rail costs about 3 times more than moving it by pipeline. That's expensive. Second, people remember what happened in 2013. The tragedy in the small town of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec. A freight train carrying oil is left without an engineer and starts rolling downhill. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. It enters town and derails right in the center. Cars flip, tankers rupture, the oil ignites almost immediately. Flames swallow nearby blocks. Explosions rock the area, heard from miles away. That night, 47 people died. Downtown Lac-Mégantic was essentially wiped out, and Canada learned a harsh lesson. Oil trains are not only costly, they can become a disaster. So in the end, there's no truly smooth path for Alberta's oil to reach eastern Canada, and that's why in 2023 and 2024, the country imported around 500,000 barrels per day from the US, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia. But wait, is it really more profitable to ship oil from the other side of the planet? Well, this is where things get complicated. Buying and delivering oil from Saudi Arabia or Nigeria costs roughly $70 to $80 per barrel. Meanwhile, sending Canada's own oil by pipeline costs only $3 to $5 per barrel, and by rail, $10 to $15 per barrel. If the difference is that huge, why can't Canada, despite the problems and risks, ship Alberta oil by train anyway? Or spend big on a pipeline and move oil for pennies? Here's where the next problem comes. Canada can't really use its own black gold the way it would like to. Let me explain. In Alberta, oil is extracted from oil sands, which leads to a product often referred to as quite a complex substance. But how can oil be complex? It's just a black liquid, right? Actually, oil comes in different types. There's light oil, thin and flowing, almost like vegetable oil. It's easier to pump, transport, and refine. At a refinery, gasoline and diesel can be made from it quickly. The equipment wears less and everything runs smoothly. Now let's head to Alberta. The oil there is different. It's thick, viscous, almost like syrup. Sometimes it's like softened asphalt. To get it flowing through pipelines, it has to be mixed with special additives or heated up. Otherwise, it'll just freeze inside the pipe. And that's just the beginning. It contains a lot of sulfur, metals, heavy fractions, and bitumen. These are all nightmares for refineries. The biggest problem is that it's hard to refine this oil into the gasoline and diesel we're used to. It requires additional processing stages, more energy, more equipment, and more time. But Canada knows what kind of oil they have, so what's stopping them from refining it and using it? Here's the catch. Most refineries in Quebec and Atlantic Canada were built 40 to 50 years ago. Back then, the market was full of light oil from the North Sea and the Middle East. That's what the refineries were designed for. If you send heavy oil with high sulfur and metal content to such a refinery, the equipment will operate at its limits, it'll wear out faster, the yield of refined products will drop, and the amount of residual fuel oil will increase. Also, heavy Canadian oil requires special systems for processing and powerful hydrodesulfurization units to remove the sulfur, which is abundant in this oil, which raises an obvious question. If Western Canada has an oil surplus, why not just upgrade the refineries on the East Coast? The money would eventually come back, right? That sounds reasonable until you look at the price tag. One modern coking unit with infrastructure costs between $2 and $5 billion. That's just for one refinery. And that's an investment with a payback period of 15 to 25 years. That means a company invests billions today and doesn't start earning back real profits until a quarter century later. Now imagine how much it would cost to upgrade all the refineries. But why imagine it? Let's do the math. Ontario has a few large refineries, Quebec has a couple, and New Brunswick has at least one. In total, there are about 10 refineries here, so the cost of modernization would be somewhere between $2 to $50 billion, plus a pipeline would be needed. All in all, it would take forever to pay off. So what can Canada do? Where would it send its oil? This is where the U.S. comes in. Canada sends 97% of its heavy oil, almost all of Alberta's production, to its southern neighbor, and in return, it suffers immense losses. But why does the U.S. need it? And what losses are we talking about? To understand that, we have to jump back to the 20th century. At some point, the U.S. realized an unpleasant truth. Its own supply of light crude was shrinking, and most refineries were built to process only light oil. So the U.S. looked around and noticed Venezuela and Mexico, both producers of heavy crude. The country decided to retool its system around those kinds of supplies. Hundreds of billions of dollars went into so-called deep refining. Refineries were built and upgraded to digest heavy, thick crude. By the 2020s, the U.S. had more than 130 refineries in operation, and about 70% of them could process heavy oil. So here's the logical question. If Venezuela and Mexico are right next door, why would the U.S. also need Canadian oil? Well, look, Venezuela, a country with enormous reserves, fell into crisis by the 2000s. Production dropped sharply, exports became unstable and politically toxic. As for Mexico, it chose to keep more oil at home and develop its own refining capacity. Older fields depleted faster than new ones came online, exports declined. And that's how you end up with this situation. The U.S. has dozens of refineries designed for heavy crude. Billions have been invested, but there isn't a reliable supply. And that's when Alberta enters the scene. What does that mean? Massive volumes of heavy oil, a politically stable country, a shared border, pipelines can be built straight across. In short, not taking advantage of a neighbor like that would have been impossible. Sounds great. Neighbors trade, make money, everyone's happy. So what damage could Canada possibly be taking? Here's the catch. Alberta's main heavy blend, Western Canadian Select or WCS, is almost always sold at a discount. That's not only because heavy crude is lower quality, logistics is also a big constraint. Alberta is far from the ocean. When there aren't enough pipelines, oil has to move by rail or via longer indirect routes. That's more expensive, slower, and less efficient, which means the buyer pushes the price down even further. How hard does that hit Canada? We're not talking about losing a couple million. Between 2010 and 2016, Alberta estimated more than $6 billion in lost royalties. And that's just one province. In 2018, total losses to the national economy were estimated at roughly $19 billion for that year. So yes, Canada's economy suffers because of its own oil. But what about ordinary people? How does all of this affect them? Look, if Alberta's crude could be shipped east and refined there, the country's main regions would end up with roughly the same gasoline and refined product prices. But that's not how it works. So gasoline has to be sourced somewhere else, and Canada finds it in the United States. For example, in 2022, Canada imported about 478,000 barrels per day of finished petroleum products, and nearly 80% of that volume came from the U.S. So yes, Alberta's oil flows into the United States, and then comes back as gasoline and other products. It sounds odd, but that's Canada's reality. And you know what the problem is? Because of this, gasoline prices in the eastern provinces are dictated not only by domestic costs, but also by the costs of U.S. refining and transportation. That means the price paid by Canadian consumers is higher and much more dependent on what's happening down there, outside Canada. This is a very real dependence on the U.S., which raises the question, after taking losses like this, can't Canada find a way to ship Alberta's oil east within its own borders? No, it's too expensive, too slow, and not profitable enough. So the country chose a completely different route. It launched one of the most expensive mega projects in its history. Its goal is to cut dependence on the U.S. and send Canadian oil to overseas markets. Let's start with the fact that Canada has had the Trans Mountain Pipeline since 1953. It runs from Alberta to Vancouver, so it's obviously been moving oil this whole time. So why would the country need any new mega projects if it already has a pipeline? That should be enough to ship oil to Asia or anywhere else, right? In reality, it's not as simple. Trans Mountain was never built as a major export artery. Its capacity is about 300,000 barrels a day. Back in the 1950s, that was plenty. But production in Alberta has multiplied since then, and the old line could no longer keep up. When the pipeline's running at full tilt, there isn't much room left to talk about large-scale exports across the ocean. Okay, so what mega project could fix that? You're looking at Trans Mountain Expansion, the expanded version of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Its price ballooned from 5.4 to 34 billion Canadian dollars. So what did they pay for? Look here, the route stayed the same. Oil leaves Alberta, crosses British Columbia, passes through mountain corridors, rivers, protected areas, and reaches the coast, into the Burnaby terminal. But in reality, it's essentially a different system. Capacity increased from roughly 300,000 to nearly 900,000 barrels a day. For the first time, Canada gained the ability to send overseas not leftover volumes, but a steady, reliable stream. But if the coastal terminal was built around 300,000, how could it now ship 900,000? They had to rebuild almost everything. They expanded the tank farm and added new steel storage tanks to accumulate crude and smooth out supply swings. They also increased the number of berths and upgraded the docks so modern large tankers can call there. And of course, they installed new pump stations and strengthened the pumping systems. In other words, they took 1950s infrastructure and scaled it up to a 21st century level. Still, I don't get it. How did the cost jump that much? From $5.4 to $34 billion is just insane. First, the project ran into long legal and regulatory delays, including mandatory consultations with Indigenous communities, which triggered new environmental reviews and approvals. Every pause automatically increased costs for labor, materials, equipment, everything. Then nature joined the fight. British Columbia saw flooding and extreme weather that seriously slowed construction. I mean, how are you supposed to build when the pipe literally gets washed away? And finally, inflation and rising steel prices delivered the last blow. In the end, the price went through the roof, but the project still got finished. But building it's one thing, making it actually work is another. So the obvious question is, did Canada manage to ship oil anywhere other than the U.S.? Yes, absolutely. Since May 2024, when the expanded Trans Mountain officially started operating, Canada has been able to send oil regularly to countries beyond the United States. In the first year, exports through British Columbia terminals increased more than sixfold compared with the previous period. Nearly half, about 48%, went not to the U.S., but elsewhere. For Canada, that's the kind of shift people have been waiting decades to see. The biggest buyer was China. Other destinations included Singapore, South Korea, and India. But you know what really matters? The scale. Since June 2024, over the entire period it's been operating, the pipeline has been sending about 207,000 barrels a day to China and 173,000 to the U.S. So it really is helping Canada move its oil out. And most importantly, heavy Canadian crude sells for a higher price in Asia than it does in the U.S., which means Canada is losing less money than before. But is a single expanded Trans Mountain enough to reduce dependence? Unfortunately, no. Even if the entire pipeline were used purely for exports and Canada completely forgot about the U.S., that would still be only about 890,000 barrels a day. Meanwhile, in 2024, Canada exported 4 million barrels a day to the United States. Overall, it feels insignificant. But there's another idea, much more ambitious. This is about a new oil transport project in the country. The route logic is the same from Alberta's oil sands to the Pacific coast of British Columbia. But this time, it's not an expansion of the old line, it's a separate, standalone pipeline. So if you're building a new line rather than an add-on to the old one, how do you choose where it should reach the ocean? In reality, the project hasn't locked in a final route yet, but there's one strong candidate. The pipeline would terminate near the port of Prince Rupert. And that choice is anything but random. Prince Rupert is one of the closest North American ports to Asia. From there, shipping routes to Japan, South Korea, and China are shorter than from the Vancouver area. That saves both time and fuel. It's also a deep water port. Large tankers can dock without complicated maneuvering or draft restrictions, and the bigger the vessel, the lower the transport costs per barrel. That makes the logistics more stable and the schedule more predictable. There's another advantage too. The port sits in a relatively sparsely populated area. Less dense urban development means fewer social conflicts and potentially fewer consequences if something goes wrong. But the main question remains, how can a second pipeline seriously reduce dependence on the U.S.? It's actually simple. This wouldn't be just any pipeline. It would be a massive line able to move around 1 million barrels per day of heavy crude from Alberta. But that's not even the key point. The real difference is that this pipeline wouldn't be an extension of the route that's historically been used and is still used to send oil to the U.S. It would be an entirely new corridor for black gold, dedicated fully to export across the Pacific. If the project goes ahead, will it reduce Canada's dependence? Absolutely. Still, none of this helps Eastern Canada, which imports oil and refined products. Alberta's oil remains a resource that supplies the country mainly with money only.